The rain hammered against the diner windows like bullets against steel. Charles Bronson sat in his usual corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The truck stop off Interstate 90 was nearly empty, just him, a tired waitress, and the rhythmic drumming of the storm outside. He came here every Thursday night, a ritual born from the need to be around people without actually having to interact with them. After 15 years in Montana, Charles had perfected the art of solitude in crowds. The bell above the door chimed, and an old man shuffled in, soaked to the bone. He wore a worn military jacket too thin for the October cold, and moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had long since stopped cooperating with his will. The waitress, Sarah, hurried over with a towel. "Lord have mercy, sir, you're drenched. Come sit down, I'll get you some coffee." The old man's eyes swept the empty diner and landed on Charles's booth. Something flickered in his gaze, recognition, maybe, or just the calculus of a man who'd learned to read people quickly. He made his way over. "Mind if I sit?" His voice was rough, weathered by time and cigarettes. Charles looked up, his expression neutral. After a moment, he gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Name's Walter Green," the old man said, settling into the booth with a grunt. "Used to be Sergeant Green, but that was a lifetime ago." Charles nodded once, offering nothing in return. Walter seemed content with the silence. He accepted the coffee from Sarah with a grateful smile and wrapped his gnarled hands around the cup. "You got that look," Walter finally said, his eyes studying Charles. "The one that says you've seen things. Done things. Things that changed you." Charles's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Don't worry, son, I'm not asking," Walter continued. "I've got that look too. Anyone who's been through it can spot it a mile away." "Through what?" Charles heard himself ask, his voice low and gravelly. "War. Loss. The kind of darkness that follows you home." Walter took a long sip of coffee. "I was in the Second World War. Europe. Saw action from Normandy to Berlin." Charles leaned back slightly, his interest piqued despite himself. "Never heard of me, have you?" Walter asked. "No reason you should have. History forgot about what we did. Hell, they buried it on purpose." The wind howled outside. Sarah refilled their cups and retreated to the kitchen, sensing this was a conversation that needed privacy. "April 1945, Walter began, his eyes going distant. "The war in Europe was almost over. My unit, the 115th Infantry Regiment, we were pushing through southern Germany. We got intelligence about an SS research facility hidden in the mountains near Berchtesgaden. Our orders were simple: secure the facility and prevent the destruction of any documents." Walter's voice dropped lower. "What we found there, it wasn't in any history book. They made damn sure of that." Charles leaned forward, drawn in despite his usual guardedness. The facility was mostly abandoned. The SS had fled in a hurry. "And in the basement, behind 3 locked doors, we found them." "Found what?" Charles asked. 37 prisoners. Allied soldiers, British, American, Canadian. POWs who'd been reported as killed in action. Men whose families had already buried empty caskets and moved on with their grief. The diner seemed to grow colder. Charles felt something twist in his chest. "They'd been using them for medical experiments," Walter continued, his voice hollow. "Testing limits of human endurance, cold, heat, starvation, sleep deprivation. Most of them weren't right anymore. The physical wounds could heal, but what they'd done to their minds." "What happened to them?" Charles asked. Walter's eyes met his, filled with profound pain. "We radioed up the chain of command, reported what we'd found. 37 Allied soldiers, alive but broken. You'd think there'd be celebrations, right? Parades. Grateful families." He shook his head slowly. 2 days later, officers arrived from intelligence. They confiscated all our reports, all the documents. They interviewed each of us separately, made us sign papers under threat of court-martial. The official story became that we'd found the facility empty. No prisoners. No survivors. Why? Charles's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. The experiments, Walter said bitterly. The Nazis had been meticulous in their documentation. And our government wanted that research. The problem was, if those 37 men came home, there would be questions. Investigations. The research would be exposed, probably destroyed. So they what? Kept them there. Worse. They told those men that their families had moved on. Showed them newspaper clippings of their own funerals, photos of widows who'd remarried, children who'd grown up believing Daddy was a hero. They said that coming back would destroy their families all over again. That the kindest thing they could do was stay dead. Charles felt his hands clench into fists. And they believed it. Most of them were so broken they didn't have the strength to fight anymore. They offered them money, new identities, jobs in veteran hospitals under false names. They made it clear, there was no coming back. They'd been erased from history. The old man's voice cracked. I watched them load those men onto trucks in the middle of the night. And we were told that if we ever spoke about it, we'd be charged with treason. Our careers would be destroyed, our families ruined. But you kept quiet, Charles said, no judgment in his voice. For 70 years, I kept quiet, Walter confirmed. Went home, married, had 3 kids, lived a normal life. But every single day, I thought about those 37 men. The ones who were found but stayed lost. Silence settled over the table, heavy and profound. Why tell me? Charles finally asked. Why now? Walter smiled sadly. Because I'm dying. Pancreatic cancer. Got maybe 2 months left. And because when you've carried a secret this heavy for this long, you realize that truth needs to be spoken, even if it's just to one person in a truck stop diner. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of yellowed paper. I kept one thing from that day. A list, 37 names, their real names, their units, and the dates they were supposed to have died. He slid it across the table. I don't know what you'll do with this. Maybe nothing. But I'm trusting you with it because you've got that look, the look of a man who understands that some truths are worth carrying, even when they're heavy. Charles stared at the paper but didn't touch it. What do you want me to do? Whatever feels right to you, Walter said, standing slowly with obvious pain. I'm not asking you to be a hero. Most of those men are long dead now anyway. But their families, some of them might still be alive. Children, grandchildren. People who grew up believing a lie. He placed a $20 bill on the table. Maybe that truth deserves to see daylight. Or maybe some truths are better left buried. I can't make that choice anymore, I made mine 70 years ago. Walter extended his hand, and after a moment, Charles shook it. The old man's grip was weak but steady. Thank you for listening, son. Sometimes that's all an old man needs, someone to bear witness before the story dies with him. Charles watched as Walter shuffled toward the door. Just before leaving, the old man turned back. One more thing. One of those 37 men, his name was James Keller. He didn't go quietly. He fought, screamed, begged to be allowed to go home to his wife and baby daughter. They sedated him, hauled him away still fighting. His daughter would be in her 80s now, if she's still alive. Sarah Keller was her name. I thought about finding her 1,000 times, but I was a coward. The door closed behind him, the bell chiming softly. Charles sat frozen, staring at the folded paper on the table. He finally reached for it, unfolding it with careful hands. 37 names stared back at him. His eyes found James Keller, *Sergeant, 82nd Airborne. Kia, official, March 15, 1945. Alive as of April 28, 1945. Wife, Margaret Keller, daughter, Sarah, born 1944, *. Charles refolded the paper and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He left $40 on the table and walked out into the Montana night. The rain had stopped, and the sky was clearing, revealing a field of stars. Charles stood in the parking lot, his hand over his pocket where the paper rested. For 15 years, he'd been running from his own past, from his own darkness. He'd convinced himself that isolation was peace, that silence was strength. But Walter Green had just handed him something that challenged everything he'd built. A truth too heavy to carry alone, and too important to bury. Charles climbed into his truck and pulled out his phone. After several searches, he found what he was looking for, a genealogy website. He typed in Sarah Keller and added the birth year 1944. 3 results. One had died in 2003. Another lived in Florida. The third lived in Billings, Montana. Just 2 hours away. Charles sat in his truck for a long time, engine idling, breath fogging the windshield. He thought about Walter Green, carrying that burden for 70 years. He thought about 37 men who'd been asked to stay dead. He thought about a little girl named Sarah who'd grown up believing her father was a hero buried in Europe, never knowing he'd survived, never knowing he'd fought to come home to her. Some truths, Walter had said, deserved to see daylight. Charles put his truck in gear and pulled out of the parking lot, heading not home, but toward Billings. He didn't know what he'd say, didn't know if he'd even have the courage to knock on the door. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Walter Green had trusted him with something incredible, not just a secret, but a choice. The choice to let truth die in the darkness, or to give it one last chance to breathe. And Charles Bronson, a man who'd spent 15 years running from his own truths, finally understood that some burdens weren't meant to be carried in silence. Sometimes, the bravest thing you could do was simply to speak.